Welcome, everyone. I'm Benny Kovacs, and this is Alexander Mansham, and we're about to participate in a discussion with Mr. Morten Traavik, who's a Norwegian artist, and recently participated in the Symposium on cultural diplomacy in Nordic countries. So I guess first question I'd like to ask you is, within your lecture, you emphasized that a benefit of culture in general, and the term culture, lies in its ambiguity. And I was wondering how you can take advantage of that ambiguity in terms of fostering better relations. For example, with your recent project in North Korea, did the ambiguity of culture benefit your interactions with the government there, or were you able to kind of enter into that situation more easy because culture is ambiguous?
To start from the end, yes, because culture has its defining features by being able to carry many messages at once, and I think this distinguishes it from, for instance, from politics, from commercials, from propaganda, which all carry one very defined message that is aimed at convincing the receiver to buy into those values, you could say. Mm-hmm. So definitely being an artist and working with, you could say, artistic strategies, both in implementing the projects, but also with the content of the actual performances, exhibitions, and so on. I always try to make sure that the content should be pushing some boundaries, but in both directions. So the answer to your question is yes. I think that one of the reasons why projects like the ones that I'm working with in North Korea are actually possible is that culture is normally regarded as being, relatively cute and harmless and diplomatic when it comes to culture as a tool for international exchanges.
Okay. So you think in terms of interacting with countries that are viewed in a less positive manner, culture is specifically important in kind of opening a dialogue in general?
Well, there is, of course, is an element of realpolitik in it as well. I mean, cultural diplomacy, you can conduct as much cultural diplomacy as you like and be very successful, but if there is no political will behind it to follow, and to follow in those tracks or walk through those doors or even small keyholes that you have established, then it doesn't really matter. So for it to become efficient, for it to have like an impact on a grander scale than just the event itself, which can be very pleasant and productive, you need, of course, political will behind it. So I would say that what cultural diplomacy can do is that it opens a window of opportunity, and also it can in its best moments create a bigger understanding of not only your own culture but also the other side's culture. And I think a lot of good human interaction on both the personal level and the global level has to start from understanding. Without understanding, a lot of bad things can happen.
All right, thank you.
Could you explain or elaborate possibly a little bit more on how you managed to gain clearance into doing the whole project in North Korea? You mentioned before that the Norwegian federal government was helping you with the whole process. But what other avenues need to be explored for something like that to become possible?
Yeah, well, the Norwegian government aren't actually helping that much either. The Norwegian Ministry of Culture has very generously supported these projects with funding. On the other hand, they are not involved in the actual implementation or at any other level than a funding partner. On the other hand, the Norwegian Ministry of Affairs don't want to touch it at all, because for them it's toxic. They don't have any policy on North Korea, and they don't really want one because it's risky business. But, and again, here I can exploit the notion in my country, in our civilization, of culture as something that should be controversial, you know, it should be rock and roll, it should push boundaries, all these cliches that you hear in any opening speech of any cultural conference, excluding this one, of course. That culture should be a tool of challenging people's preconceptions. My experiences in our part of the world is that more often than not, when you actually take those statements at face value and you do challenge some preconceptions, those people who say it don't actually mean it, most of them. Which is, for me, it's not a negative thing, because it creates a very, very important dynamic of friction. And friction can lead to discussion, it can also lead to, to both fusion and fission, to say it like that. But the very fact that I am an artist, and also in some circles regarded as a controversial artist and so on, makes it, in one way, it makes it easier to have acceptance in the cultural environment of Europe, that I am doing something which is controversial and subversive, like dealing with an evil country like North Korea at all.
We saw throughout your discussion numerous wonderful videos with some of the work you've done throughout Cambodia and also in Korea. You did mention at the end of your speech that you would like to encourage people to come and approach you about the possibility of joining you in North Korea. Could you expand a little bit further on what you plan to do in the not so distant future?
Certainly. The latest project that I am now developing in North Korea, in close collaboration with North Korean cultural authorities, because, mind you, there is no other way in a country like North Korea, and also in some other authoritarian dictatorships or state structures, that if you want to work there, you have to work with the government, because there are no structures there is no civil society, there are no counter forces or you know, dissidents or so on. It doesn't exist in a country like North Korea. So we are now planning what we have labeled the DMZ Academy. The DMZ named after the demilitarized zone, which splits the Korean peninsula, which is a symposium for artists, international artists and Korean artists together, who will work together for a period of 2 weeks. We call it like a temporary academy that we will do together in Pyongyang in August 2015. But in calling it an academy, we also invite more than just applied arts. You know, it should also be a forum where you can discuss cultural diplomacy or, you know, different strategies. Not very unlike this conference. Would definitely have a place in a forum like that as well. So the plan is that for these 2 weeks we are together, the international artists that will come from a selected number of non-Korean countries, with emphasis on European or like what we call the Western countries, with embassies in North Korea, because this is also something many people don't know, that many major European countries do have diplomatic relations with North Korea. So the artists will be giving work demonstrations from their own work. They will be giving lectures about their own work for the other participants. And the Korean artists will do the same. Then, through this series of work demonstrations and lectures, we will also encourage them to create something together that will be part of a joint exhibition that we will stage at the end of this period. So the DMZ Academy kind of makes it its first appearance on the world stage in North Korea. But we also think that this concept is perfectly well adaptable and applicable to also to other zones of seemingly intractable or locked conflicts.
Okay. You mentioned the DMZ, the 38th parallel. To what extent do you think, or do you envision a scenario where the improvement of cultural diplomatic ties with North Korea and other countries will be sufficient in itself to drastically change the situation throughout the country, or will that require some other form of intervention?
Well, I think to drastically change any country or any culture, you need thousands of years of gradual adaptation and gradual intermingling and gradual friction or fusion. So I think the case for radical intervention or like radical change, especially imposed from the outside, has not been very strong lately. You know, when you see the products as we speak of attempts in Afghanistan, in the Middle East,
there's so
in
much
Libya,
else going on.
to kind of forcibly import human rights and democracy at the tip of a bayonet, you know. So what I think, again, in its best moments, that cultural diplomacy can do is that we can offer another view of things, and it's entirely up to the recipient or the collaborator or whatever you want to call it, if he or she wants to take that view to heart. More than that, we cannot and should not aim to do, because then we are already into the very problematic field of humanitarian interventions or you know, imposing our values. Our values, I'm actually very proud of the values that made Scandinavia and Europe and parts of the Western world what it is, and we should definitely not underplay those values, but we cannot go to work with an expectation that, like in North Korea, that basically all North Koreans are closet social democrats just waiting to be liberated. You know, I think recent history has shown us quite on the contrary, that culture takes a lot of time to change, even when the people within that culture are motivated to change it. And quite often they are not.
It's ingrained within the whole...
We can, at best, we can be the drop that hollows out the stone. But we should also be prepared that we can be hollowed out as well. We can be, and should be, tainted of the values that the opposite side has. If we are not ready to be inspired by at least some traits of the culture we're dealing with, then it is not really, it will never become an exchange on an equal level, which I believe quite often is not possible, but we should aim at a maximum level of equality in the exchange.
Okay. Did you have any further questions?
Yeah, I guess I had another question on about the role of the state in diplomatic affairs in general. I guess there's a lot of talk about, given changes in communication technology and interdependence, that the state might not be the optimal player to involve itself in diplomatic activities. What would you say about the state's future role in diplomacy, and would you define diplomacy as an action or a term that's separate from the state itself, because it's so often defined as statecraft alone? How do you see the diplomatic institutions specifically adapting to changing global circumstances?
I mean, I don't see the one excluding the other. Of course, you know, God forbid that all diplomacy should be conducted by needy artists with vulnerable egos and crazy ideas running around. We definitely don't want that. But I think those two forms of diplomacy can make each other better. and not only coexist but also be inspired by each other. And this is where I think a culture-based people-to-people approach can work very well beside, you know, the traditional horse trading, palm pressing, backroom dealing, diplomacy of the established political circles. We need both. But so far, we haven't tried really that much what I would call cultural diplomacy for real. So I think that's where the potential for growth and expansion is definitely biggest.
Right.
Terrific. Well,
all right,
thank you very much for taking the time to,
thank you very much
to speak to us today. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Was I good?